To Death Professional from Dental Hygienist, A Divine Calling, with Marguerite O'Connor. Marguerite O'Connor is co-author of Griefstruck, When a Death Changes Your Life. She is currently Goodwill Ambassador for Chicago Jewish Funerals. Marguerite previously served as a funeral director, funeral celebrant, and mortuary college instructor. Marguerite is a member of American Association of University Women, League of Women Voters, and Toastmasters International. Marguerite is passionate about sharing lessons learned, as you will now hear. Marguerite O'Connor, welcome to Unveiling Death.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Nice to have you here. So, your career trajectory when you were a young woman shifted into the world of death and bereavement very quickly and very interestingly. Can you talk about that?
Yes, I was a dental hygienist and I was enjoying that profession. And one day I met a patient, and just a conversation with him changed the trajectory. And I became curious about funeral service and called the school and ultimately found myself enrolled and later ended up teaching there as well.
So, number one, what did this person in the dental chair say, and how were you able to understand him if he had cotton in his mouth? Number one, and number two, um, did you call immediately, or like how did that? When did you make that call?
He was a financial advisor who had just had lunch that day with a funeral director. He was curious about my professional background as a dental hygienist. I mentioned some of the courses I took at Loyola, like head and neck anatomy and things of that nature. He was a humorous man, and he found it funny that I took some courses that were similar to the discussion that he had with his client, this funeral director. And then he went on to say where the mortuary school was located. I was not familiar with it. I called the school after I finished with that patient. The owner answered the phone. Everything just kind of aligned. And when I reflect back, I had an experience where my father died when I was a month old. My mother was widowed at a young age. So, in reflecting on it later, that probably has a connection.
Right. So, you, to make sure that I and our millions of listeners understand, you after this, you had this conversation with this humorous man, um, the financial advisor whose teeth you were cleaning. You called before your next before the next person sat down in that chair, or at least before the your next. You called before your next dental patient.
It just so happened that my next patient was running late. I had a little time. I utilized that time. And again, it really did feel like an alignment.
Did it feel like an alignment then, or as you alluded to before, years later, you kind of look back on it and thought, like, also given the fact that your father died before you knew him because you were only a month old, was it just really in retrospect?
It was in retrospect because, again, I found out later there was a secretary that worked at the school, but that is not who answered the phone the day that I called. It happened to be the owner of the school who gave me a great sales pitch. And before I got off that call, she had invited me to come and tour the school. And again, to me, when I reflect back, everything just aligned in a forward trajectory.
Right. You had momentum suddenly in a different
Yes.
direction. Wow. So if your dad had not died when you were 1 month old, do you think it would have resonated what this financial advisor in the dental chair had said to you? Would it have resonated anyway, do you think? Or somehow was that really playing into this in a deep, if subconscious way?
I didn't probably realize it at the time, but I was sort of death curious. And my father died of heart disease at a young age, so he was 34. And so I would say that, again, it didn't. necessarily jump out at me. I was happy doing what I was doing, but I also had a job in high school where I worked for the local orthodontist, and they had guided me to become a dental hygienist. And even though that worked out well, I really didn't feel like that was my calling. I felt like they had given me good guidance. They told me I could make a good living if I chose to get married or have a family. I could work part-time. I mean, they gave me kind of a sales pitch on the value of dental hygiene, and that all came from just having a job when I was in high school.
Dental hygiene is important, and I want every listener to floss tonight. Would you endorse
Yes.
that? Yeah. This was a time, as you have explained to me, that, women in the field and in that school were really a minority, at least in an official way. But women had been playing a sort of important unofficial way role, obviously, for generations prior. Can you discuss that?
For those who had an open casket viewing, women often were involved in hairdressing, makeup, cosmetics, polishing nails, things of that nature. They were also bookkeepers. They were also often helping to keep the funeral home clean and maintained, although some had a separate staff for janitorial and maintenance. And some even lived above the funeral home with their families, and they would occasionally invite bereaved families to come up and have some lunch or refreshments before services began.
Wow. So these are wives of the directors, is that what you mean?
Yes.
When you entered mortuary school, I think you said there were 10% women in your class. A decade later, there were a lot more.
Yes, I graduated with honors, and then I was serving an apprenticeship for 1 year, but I was invited to teach at the school, and I did invest 8 years as an instructor at the mortuary college. And we also did practical work at the Cook County Morgue. This is where my students and I, as a student, helped to embalm the indigent and unclaimed bodies in Cook County.
Wow. Wow. So when you finished your teaching gig, I think you said 9 or 10 years later, there were, did you say 50% women?
Yes, my recollection is that it was about 51% female.
Wow. What accounts for the change?
I believe it was a variety of factors. I think that gender-specific jobs were changing. I mentioned previously being a dental hygienist, where I went to school with 40 women in my cohort. We went class to class together. There were no men at that time, but
Right.
certainly during that time period that we're talking about, men were entering nursing or what were considered more female-dominated professions and vice versa. There were women that were entering what were considered more male-dominated fields like funeral service, accounting, things of that nature.
So you are so deeply immersed in this work. You are a funeral director, you an instructor or professor, a bereavement educator, an author of, for instance, Griefstruck, When a Death Changes Your Life, which is a really invaluable book, and I thank you for my copy. And now also a Goodwill Ambassador for Chicago Jewish Funerals. So that's a lot. You have really just completely immersed yourself in this field. So is there one aspect of it that has been most fulfilling, gratifying to you, or is it impossible to kind of parse that out? Is it all part of the same gestalt for you?
Thank you. It's all very gratifying. And again, I would use the example of being an author of one of those alignments. Someone said to me, "You should meet this other woman because you're both very passionate about death and dying and funeral service." So I met my co-author, and the rest is history there. She was working in hospice at the time. And I also evolved into doing funeral celebrant work. So I did become certified as a funeral celebrant, and that happened when I was teaching at the mortuary college. I was aware of Doug Manning doing these certifications. I invited him to come, and I, along with those of my students who wanted to become certified as funeral celebrants, participated in that. So it really evolved. And sometimes I was redirected. For example, in my 30s, I was diagnosed with thyroid cancer, and my doctor said, get out of the prep room, stop exposing yourself to these chemicals. So at that point, that might have been considered more of a negative, but then that redirected me to move away from the embalming aspect of my license of funeral director and embalmer and focus more on advanced funeral planning. I learned a lot from that phase, helping people organize their end of life concerns and putting them in writing. And so, again, several things just sort of evolved, sometimes with a gentle nudge, and sometimes a little more than that.
So really I mean, your answer is that there's really no answer in terms of what part of this work you feel most gratified or fulfilled by.
That is correct. It was a continuum. And once again, as a first generation funeral director at the time that I went to mortuary school, I felt like I really couldn't pick and choose. I had to accept opportunity as it unfolded. So, for example, I would have a trade embalmer, so that's someone who does embalming for more than one location or more funeral home. And I would have a trade embalmer ask me, hey, can you cover the holiday for me? Or I would have funeral home owners ask if I could cover when they went on vacation, things of that nature. So again, I would say just being open to the opportunities gave me a chance to see the various aspects.
You just mentioned you were first generation,
Correct. A lot of funeral home names were like so and so and son.
right?
And there were a few obstacles, I would say, as a woman in funeral service, but for the most part, I would say my classmates were very welcoming and respectful.
Right. I mean, there seems like there were two obstacles. One was because you were in a minority as a woman, and also you went into this as not part of not you didn't inherit this work. You were called
Right.
to it, but you were the first person in your family called to it. So you really kind of went in as as a very new presence in the field.
That is correct. And also, I gained a new perspective as a mortuary college instructor because sometimes my students would share with me, hey, Marguerite, I don't really want to do this. And I'd be like, I'm sorry, what did you say? Like, or why are you here? Just help me understand. Not like a judgment, but like help me understand this conversation. And some of them felt really pressured to go into the family business. And we see that not only in funeral service, but any type of family business where the previous generation has worked hard. There's even a wonderful book called Confessions of a Funeral Director by a young man who had several generations ahead of him. And he talks about the honor of working in the family business and serving bereaved families, but also the pressure that he felt. And it's sometimes not a good fit for everyone. And it's a very courageous time to sometimes say, hey, this is not a good fit for me, even if you know you're disappointing your family or friends.
Do you ever get having and still spending a career in the death and bereavement world? Um, People ever say to you at a cocktail party or something like that, that's what you do? That seems so depressing.
Yes, and my answer to that is that I see a lot of love stories, but certainly there are elements of sadness, and there are colleagues who do self-describe as experiencing compassion fatigue or what we would call burnout. And again, we see this in the medical field and other areas as well. It can also be a challenge in your world as clergy or in my world of funeral service when you have a death in your own family. So, for example, that's an additional layer of challenge. My mother was dying in 2001, and I was teaching at the mortuary college. And there was one day where like I said to my students, okay, I think we went over this already, did we? And I'm like, this is what grief looks like because I'm in anticipatory grief right now because my mother is terminally ill, has a life-limiting condition. So again, all of those things just kind of mesh, but I found, the best way through it is just being authentic and having people understand. And I would say also that I had some students that would write beautiful notes to me, thanking me for teaching them or talking about lessons learned, and that is very gratifying as well. And same with when you serve families on sometimes one of the worst days of their lives, there's a deep level of gratitude and appreciation.
Absolutely. There's probably nothing more gratifying than either of those things, hearing from students and from families that you've served. Marguerite, you've mentioned a number of times that everything seemed to align in your career pivot coming into the funeral and bereavement world. So, does this mean that you believe that there is some sort of divine intervention in this pivot? And what I'm really asking is, do you believe that this is a calling? And the reason I say divine intervention is because I, as a clergy person, receive that question a lot, whether or not I have been called or how was I called to the rabbinate. So do you believe for you in the direction that you have been in for these decades, have been called in some divine way to this work?
Yes, definitely. And I would say that I distinguish a calling from a vocation in that there is more of a feeling of passion or dedication. We all make certain sacrifices in our jobs, but again, distinguishing it was not just a job for me.
Right, right. It was there a and this might get to your religious beliefs as well. Was is God involved in this in any way? That's really what I'm asking. In these beyond vocations, these professions in which we feel that kind of passion and everything seems to align, and we feel like we might be directed. In other words, that there's a direct door and we're directed in a certain direction. Is that part of this for you as well, or was it that you passionately chose with your completely only your own agency chose to do this work?
I do feel there was a divine element, and it was more in retrospect that I looked and saw more than coincidence, that there were connections. And one of my favorite local authors, who's internationally known as Carolyn Myss, Myss, and she talks about this as well, that when there is a calling, your life is gonna be changed, and once again, it doesn't feel as much as a burden as it generally, for me anyway, felt like a noble profession, and I had had many jobs prior to this, and I'm grateful for all of them. I learned things in all of those as well as earning income, but definitely this was different.
Yeah, it is sort of interesting just in our own lives how a little perspective, maybe at the time it might or might not seem like an alignment or that there's some sort of direct door and there's an actual calling, one who calls, we who are called. Maybe at the time it doesn't seem that way because we're just kind of involved in it. But with some perspective, we look back, whatever that might be, for whatever profession or whatever relationship or anything, we look back and it seems like, oh wow, it really seems like things were aligned for us, that we were directed by something, and that seems like how you feel.
Yes, that resonates for me, and over time, I also learned about the concept of an evidence journal. So it's a specific notebook where I put things that I would previously have called coincidences, and when you see it in writing and you see that things have come to fruition, and I would give a shout out to the people in my life who were encouragers, because when I changed professions from dental hygienist to funeral director, embalmer, and mortuary college instructor and author, uh, there were many encouragers in my life. There were also people who were like, "What? You have a good profession as a dental hygienist. Why change? Or you worked so hard studying for that. Why change?" But as I mentioned previously, any obstacles or even skeptics don't stop you when you feel like you are on a passion project.
Amen to that. Okay, so final question, Marguerite O'Connor. As we have discussed, and this is how I conclude many of my conversations in this Unveiling Death podcast. What song would you want to hear as you lay on your deathbed in your final days, hours, minutes?
Time to Say Goodbye, particularly by Andrea Bocelli and Sarah Brightman. I was serving a family as a funeral celebrant. My friend's husband had died, and we were having a graveside service, and their son had a Jeep, and the top was open. It was summertime, and he blasted that song at the cemetery. Fortunately, we were not disturbing any families nearby, but it really resonated, and that is my answer. Yeah, Time to Say Goodbye.
Time to Say Goodbye, specifically by Bocelli and Brightman.
Yes.
Right. And that sounds like it might be a very good song for my Spotify Unveiling Death podcast playlist, which I have. So I'm going to check that out. And I am very grateful, Marguerite O'Connor, for this conversation and for your time.
Thank you. I appreciate you inviting me, and this is a wonderful opportunity, and I wish you all the best in continuing with this work. It's a very, very important topic.
Thank you. Thanks to Marguerite O'Connor for sharing her lessons learned. Thank you, my creative director, editor, and my son, Sammy Weil. Thanks to my band, the Night Owls of Chicago, for the music you're listening to right now. Check us out on SoundCloud. Contact me at rabbiw14@gmail.com. Share Unveiling Death with friends and enemies, and follow this podcast as well. Thank you so much for listening to Unveiling Death, Eternity in about 24 minutes, every other Monday.